Excuse me using a mic, but I've been talking too much and travelling on planes, and you lose your voice, as you know. I want to especially thank Nola for giving me the after-lunch session. And particularly given that you've got those terribly hard, uncomfortable seats to sit on. At least you could have given me as people sitting on tin cans or something after lunch. But thank you for inviting me, and I hope that it's worthwhile. I want to talk, as you've just heard, about human autonomy in the age of machine automation. If forward-thinking futurists and future planners and technologists have their way, within about 20 years of now, we might all be living in smart cities, smart houses, on streets that are negotiated using augmented reality, driving or being driven in cars that are powered at least in part by big data analytics, on roads where the traffic is managed using the Internet of Things. We may all be living and working in buildings that are basically self-contained hydroponic farms with walls that breathe to keep us warm and cool, with glass that changes reflectivity according to the amount of light available on any given day, with recycling plants to keep us in a fresh supply of the liquid gold of the 21st century, which is, of course, water. Many of our friends and even perhaps our lovers might be automated machines. So how close are we to this vision of the so-called smart age? Well, that's open to debate, and there's a debate raging about it right now. But I think one thing we can say for sure, ladies and gentlemen, is that the major revolutions that will underlie the so-called smart age are with us already today. And they are, both of them, major components in the automation field. The first, of course, is digitization. This is one of the foundational planks on which automation is built, so we need to consider it for a moment. In 1992, global internet traffic was the level of 0.001 gigabytes a second. Today, that's blown out to 20,000 gigabytes a second. By 2021, it will be 100,000 gigabytes globally per second. And in 2021, we will have 1 million minutes of video crossing the internet every second of the day. And we will have 3 times more gadgets hooked up to the cloud, the internet, than we do people on the planet, which is remarkable when you consider that the digital revolution is really not that old. And digitization has given us some great benefits, among them open source innovation. I know that many of you are technology people here today, so you're very familiar with this, but let me touch on it. We realize today that global problems require convergent solutions. We can no longer solve the big problems we face by having siloed industries. Church here, business here, politics over here. We have to learn to share our ideas, and we're doing it. We have medicine, working with IT, working with additive manufacturing, to give us the possibility within about 8 to 12 years of now of being able to build from nothing up a complete human organ such as a kidney or a liver for transplant purposes, using a cellular version of what we now call a 3D printer. The Internet of Things has had a lot of press in the last few years, and there's not been much action, but it's starting to pick up now. We can now foresee the time when there are billions of devices in everything from your garden sprinkler system to the food packaging in your refrigerator to the weave in your clothing that are hooked up to the internet, all receiving and sending messages, all purportedly making our lives that little bit easier. And of course, one of the big pluses with digitization is big data analytics. Does anybody here work in the field of big data? Great, welcome. Basically, I mean, essentially, it's all about having machines that are powerful enough to crunch huge amounts of data coming in from all manner of mobile devices. From the tablet in your hand to the smartphone, to the cash register of the supermarket, to your sat-nav machine, all of that information being then collated and analysed and used to predict such things as economic shifts, political voter patterns in elections, marketing trends. It's much more practical than that too, big data, because it's used today to build furniture, to build better streets, to design, in some cities in Europe, crime prevention programs. Digitization has also given us the sharing economy. This will come up again a little bit later. It's very important when you talk about automation. Sharing economy, you walk the streets of London, you can own a bicycle, affectionately called a Boris bike, or disaffectionately, whichever you choose. We have shared ownership of cars, electric cars in London today, apartments, rooms within apartments now are shared ownership. Education has gone shared ownership with the MOOC. Are we familiar with that term? the massive open online course. Schools like Stanford, Harvard, MIT, realizing that blended and online education are not a replacement for traditional education, but an adjunct to it. So they're offering full courses, some of them online, to anybody who has access to the internet. And the sharing economy is very quickly changing the nature of capitalism, because we have in a fairly short time gone from a purely institutional brand of capitalism to one which is much more free-flowing, fluid and person-to-person in nature, which makes it very hard for governments to control or regulate, which is why Uber is constantly before the courts today in Europe. When the government can work through some semi-regulatory body to make sure that standards are met, everything is fine. But when those regulatory bodies are bypassed by people doing their own thing via digital, this is a completely different world we've entered. It's changing the world of philanthropy today. Technology is the new rock and roll. How many people, be honest, are over the age of 50 like me? I'm 60 on Monday. How many 60? Oh, you guys look great. I'm looking forward to it. We remember, do we not, when we were younger, so much younger than today, when people used to line up down the street to buy record albums. Well, we don't do that anymore. When we used to take an LP home, for those of you who don't know what an LP is, ask me later, we would sit and listen in groups, and if there were social consciousness messages in that music, we might decide to actually do something about that cause. Today we do that with technology. Technology has replaced music as the hub around which social change occurs. The London riots a few years ago were driven by social media messaging. The clean-up after the riots was likewise driven by social media messaging. This has given birth to a wonderful thing we call social enterprise, which for any church leaders here today is a natural space for the church to be in. Where once we had third sector, charity and business, and the two hardly ever spoke together, now we have a middle way called social enterprise. Businesses set up exclusively with the goal of solving a social problem in a profitable way. And so I was just in South Africa a few days ago speaking to government heads, and there's a wonderful story of a company called M-Pesa or M-Pesa. Anybody heard of that? Yes, a few. It is a wonderful social enterprise story where in Africa we have many people in the rural areas who have an old school mobile phone, the sort of phone we were using 15 years ago, but they have no banks to use. So two social entrepreneurs, young, they're usually young, put some new school technology into old school phones and created M-Pesa, which allows people to do basic bank transactions. Today, 70% of all households in Kenya have at least one person who uses M-Pesa. That is a major success story by anybody's standards, all made possible through digitization. It's changing politics, and it will change politics in this country. Moldova is leading the way, strangely enough, a country that hardly anybody talks about, bordered by Ukraine and Romania. A few years ago was a communist country, is now a liberal democracy, has produced many gifted young technologists, and about 10 years ago suffered a major brain drain because they were all going to work in Silicon Valley. As a result of that, the Communist Party in Moldova began to see a resurgence of interest because the older population were the only ones voting. What the government did was decide to institute e-voting so that young expats on the other side of the world could vote in national elections in their homeland. That had two benefits. One, obviously, it left these young adults feeling my country still cares about me, so maybe I'll go back to visit or to live. And secondly, it meant that the Communist Party lost support and was held at bay in terms of local and national elections. But there are challenges with digitization, are there not? One of them is what I call soft surveillance, privacy. Samsung Television, just over a year ago, issued a warning to all the users of its smart TVs that the voice recognition technology within these units, which was used to recognize speech commands, actually records conversations held in the living room. And because these recordings are stored in the cloud, Samsung was concerned that they might be accessed by hackers. Now, I think George Orwell would have loved that. Your TV is watching you, right? This is one of the challenges when it comes to big data. For all of its wonders, it is a form of soft surveillance. We have the challenge now of biohacking. In Sweden, just outside of the beautiful city of Stockholm, is a work centre called Epicenter. Many industries work there. And the authorities are encouraging people in that work centre to have RFIDs, radio frequency identification tags, size of a grain of rice, built into their skin, subcutaneous chips, which they can use to open the security doors at work, run the photocopy machine, and even buy their lunch at the canteen. Now that sounds really cool to a lot of people and really sexy, no keys to carry, no money to carry around. But we face this challenge of biohacking because, as you well know, any computerized device can, at least in theory, be hacked. And so we have to, as human beings, make the choice, do we want our bodies to become trackable and hackable devices? How do we avoid that in the age of digitization? It's the question of who owns the data we produce. While most people, perhaps not us in this room, but most people on Facebook are just very generous in everything they tell Mr. Zuckerberg, thinking that they own the data, when in fact Mr. Zuck owns the data and of course uses it to sell to marketers. That's how he makes his profits. And he's not the only one. All social media outfits do the same thing. As long as we know who owns the data when we're doing that, we're okay. And privacy, if you study the area of surveillance and studies conducted into surveillance, especially in the United States and Europe today, you find that one thing comes through over and over again, that the more people feel they're being watched when they make a choice, the less likely they are to make either an independent or necessarily wise choice. Because the process of social acculturation among human beings is so strong that if we feel like we're being watched by a dominant culture, we're more likely, even though we may not set out to do so, to make a choice we would not have made had we not been watched. I don't have time to go into that, but we can talk about it later if you wish. The other major revolution that is shaping the automation process, of course, is machine learning, and I'm sure we've talked about that already today. But 15 years ago, check it out on YouTube, Sony couldn't get a robot to walk. Now they can run, they can walk, they can climb stairs, they can play football, at least better than I can. They can even greet presidents at trade fairs in Tokyo. If you go to a mobile phone store in Tokyo today, the first, quote, being you are likely to engage with will be a social bot. A machine that is programmed with software developed at Cambridge University. I was in Cambridge the other day. It's called Emote. It allows machines, of course, to biometrically read your facial expressions, gauge your emotions as a result, and then respond in kind. 1,000 care homes a couple of years ago who used these social bots as carers, 90% of the clients said, I prefer the robotic carer to the human variety. Emote bots. The US Navy today is discussing whether or not we can teach robots to think morally and ethically. Machine learning, by the way, is simply all about the fact that these machines now, because they can cut through all of that information and analyze all that data, they can spot patterns and anomalies in that data, and by doing so can improve their own programming. So they are, at least in a rudimentary sense, ladies and gentlemen, learning. And then we have deep learning. I don't know if you saw this, but NVIDIA, the chip company, last year released its first driverless car. And if you're like me, you think, ho-hum, everybody's got a driverless car this year. Everybody's putting this out. But this car had a major difference. It didn't require a software programmer to teach the car how to drive. The car learned to drive watching a human being drive a car. Now, technologists have taken to calling this deep learning. And the honest ones among them will tell you the reason they call it deep learning is in part because they don't really understand yet how it happens. They just know that it does. And so we have applications of machine learning in mining today. I was talking to mining industry leaders the other day in another country. In space, we're talking about mining the moon and Mars. We're not talking about mooning. I don't know where that came from. In space, one 500-meter asteroid can produce more platinum group materials than we've ever produced on Earth. Now, platinum group materials, if you know metallurgy, are very valuable, very rare, and used in many processes, very hard to get hold of. So there are great opportunities in underground mining, undersea mining, in the use of drones in the air, within the human body, we'll come to that in a moment, all based upon the idea of machine learning. It's the foundation of Industry 4.0, the fourth industrial revolution, which basically is a vision involving autonomous, self-repairing, self-diagnosing machines, all playing a small part in a production chain that's spread over a large geographical area, so the death of old school factories where everything is done under one roof. And because these machines are working together and learning together in the cloud, there is minimal human oversight required. In fact, it's been said, and I think it's half-jokingly, that in the factory of the near future, in the office there will be one man and one dog. And the man's job will be to feed the dog, and the dog's job will be to bite the man's hand if he touches anything. I think there's truth in that. It has big benefits, this Industry 4. It opens up space for innovation. If our ideas are realised more quickly, maybe we've got time for more ideas. Perhaps greater work satisfaction because we're not as involved in the prosaic and the mundane. We're more involved in the exciting and the specialised. Great opportunities for entrepreneurs. Because if you're responsible for building an entire multifaceted factory, that's expensive. But if you're taking just one part in that production chain, that's reasonable, that's achievable. It's also the foundation, machine learning, of what I'm going to call Education 4.0. Virtual learning, robotic teachers, for example. Already in the United States, we have virtual Einstein. He's an anthropomorphic robotic machine built to look like his namesake. By reading and studying the speeches and writings of Einstein, technologists have been able to intuit how he will respond to given questions on just about any area of life, but particularly science. So high school students now can ask Robot Einstein any science-based question and get an Einstein-like response. Early days, but the technology's there. Now just think about how quickly education's already changed under the internet. The internet, when we first started using it in the late 70s, early 80s, most of us, and then early 90s, was an information exchange. In the mid to late 90s, it quite quickly morphed into a commercial exchange. Today, though, it is increasingly a social exchange. Almost everything you do on the internet has a social component, even if it's just clicking the Twitter button to retweet that you like this article. When you use Uber, there's a social aspect to that, if you choose to use it. There's a social component to all of our internet use today. And social media today in the United States is becoming a primary source of education in many colleges. So students are not told, as I was in university, to go to the lectures or else. They're told, we don't want you to come to lectures, we want you to see them on Vimeo or YouTube, and then you come in for the tutorials. So social media is being used as a primary source. By 2020, 2/3 of students in the US will do most of their learning online, and listen to this, 10% of learning in China in tertiary institutions is already done online. Machine learning will give us medicine 4.0, for want of a better term. We're already starting to see prosthetics designed in a whole new way using things like holographic projection. Much better fitting prosthetics, much more comfortable to wear because they're designed using holograms. Nanorobotics, especially in medicine, the injection of microscopic machines built from the atomic level up to target and take out bacteria that ride on infections like tetanus. Transhumanism is now a possibility. In Oxford University, near where I live, and in Cambridge, they are seriously in schools of philosophy debating transhumanism, the idea that because of advances in machine learning and prosthetics and pharmaceuticals, we will soon likely be able to extend human life beyond its current 80 or so years on average, to the point where it's 120, 150, and perhaps some are suggesting even an indefinite period eventually. It's changing architecture. That's my background. I was an architect once upon a time. People can take WikiHouse, open source house designs off the net and build them anywhere, on any site, provided they have a fairly basic form of 3D printer and some plywood sheets. We have parametric brick houses coming out of Iran now. These are open source architecture with a very aesthetic feel for people on a limited budget. So you get these wave-form walls and fences and even roofs that are built completely by machine, though the design is human. We have drones being used on building sites in major cities now, UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles being used to bring materials on site, which means that they're a lot less messy and a lot less noisy than sites used to be. We're going somewhere with this. Now, there are challenges with machine learning, just as there are with digitization. One of them has been mentioned, underemployment. I know you've talked about that. An estimated 230 million jobs will be automated out of existence in the next 20 years globally. 35% of jobs here in the UK, according to an Oxford University report presented to the House of Lords in 2015. 40% of jobs in Australia, where I'm from, I was there recently, 40% of jobs in Australia automated out of existence. And people will no longer have to make a transition between jobs, ladies and gentlemen. They will be forced to make transitions between entire livelihoods, and quickly. And it's not just lower-end jobs, what we used to call blue-collar jobs that are affected now. I don't know if you've heard the story of Joshua Browder. He's a young London-based man of about 23 years of age. This is his mother with him here. And Joshua, who looks like he's out of the Big Bang Theory, actually, but he's a brainy guy. He's an intelligent fellow. He invented the world's first robotic lawyer. It's called Do Not Pay. It's a chat bot. You interact with it. It seems like you're talking to a human being. It has helped people in Britain and America alone to save thousands of pounds in parking fines and speeding tickets by arguing their case on their behalf. This is the work normally done by lawyers. Journalists face a challenge too, because Forbes magazine today is using Quill, which is a software program that writes articles, to produce articles in Forbes magazine. Not all of them, but some of them. It's not hard to see in 20 years, maybe 50% or more of articles will be written this way. Medicos face a challenge. In Australia right now, they're using robotic machines to perform remote surgeries on kneecaps and knees that are affected by arthritis. There is human oversight, but it won't be long before that's not needed. So in the midst of all that, we're going to need networks of businesses working together, and I'd suggest networks of churches working together to provide very basic mental health facilities. And by that, I don't mean psychiatric wings, I mean facilities that teach things like cognitive behavioural therapy, just to help people have the skills to make the transitions quickly. You say, but new technology always brings new jobs. That's true, it does. The question now, though, is can we transition fast enough to keep up with the change? And the question I know I get asked sometimes is, well, what about priests and pastors? Could a machine do the work of a church leader? And you may have seen this year that some technologists in Germany came up with a machine, a very basic robotic priest, and yes, it was just to pull the string and hear Barbie talk sort of a model, very basic. But they did it in order to start a debate about whether priests and pastors could be replaced in the 500th anniversary of the Reformation by machines. Now, my answer to the question, could a priest or pastor be replaced by a machine, is yes, if by pastor and priest you simply mean someone who runs a liturgy. If you mean somebody who processes a liturgy on a Sunday, a machine could do that because, let's face it, it doesn't require a huge amount of human intelligence or machine intelligence to go through. Whether they do it well or not is the other thing, but to go through the liturgy. But there are two things that machines can't do, which church leaders do all the time when they do their job well. One is show empathy. Empathy requires a shared human experience. Machines, by definition, do not have a shared human experience. And I'm not talking about empathy just in our counselling. I'm talking about empathy even in the preaching and teaching in public role. Because is it not true that the thing people carry away from something we say in public most is our conviction about the subject? If they get hold of the conviction that we have, they often will remember what it is exactly we have taught them. And for us to have that level of conviction, we have to learn something on more than an intellectual level. We have to learn it in a much more holistic way, if you like, or to use Jesus' words himself, in the heart, in the heart, soul, mind, and strength. Again, these are areas that are challenging for a machine. The other thing that church leaders are capable of is leadership. And let me define leadership so you know the difference between this and what a machine can do. We're not talking here about management, by the way. Management's very important to any enterprise, but it's not leadership. Management in church as in business is focused on metrics. It's focused on the necessary numbers. You know, it's very necessary work, the metrics, the pie charts, the Excel spreadsheets, all of it good. But leadership is focused more on mindset. Essentially, generically speaking, ladies and gentlemen, managers are structural engineers, but leaders are cultural architects. Leaders facilitate an environment in which people flourish and projects fly. How do they do that? By articulating vision, mapping out strategy, marshalling the right kind of activity in the group, bringing the right people in. And in doing all that, creating a milieu, as the French say, an environment in which people flourish. This, I believe, is the key role of architects. It's not place holding, it's not title holding, it's much more than that. We need more of it in politics, I dare say, today. And thank God we do have some leaders there, but we need to see more of that. We certainly need it in business, in the finance sector, and we definitely need it in some areas of church life. We need people who can lead in this way. And this is something that a machine finds hard to do, because a machine, to create a human culture, would, in a sense, have to understand human beings at a very profound level. I'm not saying it's impossible in 20 years, 30 years' time, but it's very difficult. One of the challenges, too, of automation is social cohesion. Technology gaps are already opening up. 51% of the world today uses the internet. But that still means that 49% don't have access to those opportunities. By 2025, up to, Cisco says 70%, the UN says 50% of the world's adults will use a smartphone. That's amazing when you consider that the first smartphone arrived in 2007. But of course, it still means that between 30% and 50% won't have the opportunities we take for granted. There are debt gaps. Bank losses on UK consumer credit jumped tenfold in the last 10 years. People either won't or can't pay back their credit debts. I think it is closely related to what I call digital debt. Cash, for all of its messiness and problems, has weight. You can feel it leaving your pocket. Ones and zeros of binary code have no weight. Cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin have no weight. There's no substance in the real world to these things. So in a sense, we are, by using exclusively, if we are, exclusively wave and pay and other forms of cashless, encouraging people to spend more with less forethought. And in our communities, I think we're going to see a lot more of this digital debt over the next 10 years. It strikes me as very interesting that in cities like Berlin, cities like Cambridge, it's young people at the top end of technology. Young people who are at the leading edge of app design, for example, the leading edge of building software to drive wind turbines, etc. These young people are the ones who are coming together in geographical space to form what we call innovation hubs. They recognise, if we don't, that with technology there must be proximity. If innovation is all about connections between old ideas giving birth to new ideas, then for ideas to connect, people must connect. And they do that better in close proximity than they do online. So these people at the very cutting edge of technology recognise something we need to remember, that it's important to humanise the digital. At the same time, we're trying to digitise the human. Bank of America did an experiment 2 years ago in which it gave 90 of its workers censored badges to wear for a week and tracked their movements through big data analytics, discovered something very interesting, that the people who produced most were the ones who mingled the most. So it led Bank of America, the largest bank in the country, to rearrange all of its coffee areas to make them more attractive aesthetically, to start to shift its culture, discouraging people from eating their muffin and drinking their coffee at the desk. And within 6 months, the Bank of America, one of the largest in the world, saw a boost in productivity of 10% across the nation. And they, not me, they put it down to this one thing: try to humanize the digital space. I think that's important, by the way, in church life too. Maybe to have, in the physical space of church activities, to have one area where we discourage people from using digital. Not by regulation, but by cultural expectation, just to discourage it. We want you to, in that space, do old-fashioned biometrics. Just read people's faces. Do you know, one of our leading psychiatrists in this country last year said, we have children as young as 5 now with ADD-like symptoms who are not diagnosed with attention deficit disorder. And he said the reason for it is that children as young as 5 are spending too much time multi-screening. And they're good at reading screens, he said, but not good at reading faces. We need to humanise. It may even be as simple as going into your next meeting with your team and taking a paper notebook, one without a battery. And I'll promise you something, if you want the attention of young people, drag out a big blackboard, because they've never seen one, except in movies. Not a whiteboard, a blackboard with that messy stuff called chalk. Humanise the digital. Still there? No. Okay, I'll keep going anyway. There are big challenges to cognition with automated learning and machine learning. We're already seeing this with the digital. Absent presence, 10 people in a meeting, only 6 of them really there, the other 4 are engaged in cyberspace under the table. And one study in Britain 2 years ago found that 85% of those people are tweeting people in the room with them. Challenges to shallow think. A lot of evidence coming through studies in the United States now that because we use tech so much, we're starting to think broad and narrow, but not narrow, broad and shallow, but not narrow and deep. We know a little bit about a lot, but not a lot about a little. We find it harder to specialise. I think any church leader that's serious about influence in the age of automation should get ahead of the curve and specialise in something. Because specialisation will always create some sense of need in somebody. Transactional relationships. My wife and I recently celebrated our 37th wedding anniversary. When we got married, some of you have been married longer, when we got married, we formed a transactional relationship. Davina will remember some things well, I will remember other things almost as well, and together we will get it right. That's just in case she hears this. Together we'll get it right, at least now and again. We're doing that now with machines. We don't remember what we learn on the internet. We rely on Pocket or Evernote or some other storage unit. And because it doesn't necessarily get into long-term memory, it can't produce innovation down the track. As long as we realise that. It's not the tech that's the problem. The tech's amoral. It's how we choose to use it. It's much easier to have confirmation bias today because of bubblethink, because the bots and algorithms are telling you when you search the web what they think you need to know or want to know based on your web history. So you don't get that serendipitous moment we used to have when we'd scroll through 10 pages of Google rubbish to get to the one thing we wanted. But in that 10 pages, there might be one thing we didn't know that leads us to some new idea. We have challenges with intellectual fascism on social media. And sadly, some of this comes from within the church. I'm talking broad church. This idea that I will defend for myself a right that I deny to you, the right of freedom of speech and expression. So I have the right to say this, but you don't have the right to say that. And I think the church has a powerful role to play here in being salt and light and modelling something different. Time starvation will get worse in the age of automation. We need to deal with it, need to get ahead of it. 92% of London's top CEOs in a survey 2 months ago said that they answer emails any time of day or night. 65% said they feel pressure to work on weekends. 30% said they can operate under the present level of stress for just 1 or 2 more years. And going further down the line in organisations, 20% of UK office workers answer 50 emails a day from their colleagues. Not their clients, not their potential clients, but their colleagues. The brain needs downtime, doesn't it? It needs time to assimilate what it's learning. It needs time to reflect. And that's costing US business in lost productivity something between $31 and $40 billion a year. Imagination breaks boost performance. University of California found that if you're doing a heavy technical task at your desk and you go away for just 30 minutes and do something that inspires your imagination, I don't know, read a book, listen to music, whatever it is, when you come back after those 30 minutes, you'll have a boost of 40% in your productivity. Go to universities, as I often do, and I'm sure many of you do, and speak to students. You'll find they're the ones asking the ethical questions about machine learning. Questions about means versus ends. As we play with the gadgets, do we have time to think about where they're taking us, or are we, in the words of one philosopher, building faster machines to take us nowhere? Questions about the law of unintended consequences. Are we giving enough thought to the future implications of present-day technologies? Questions about the line between human and machine. As we invite technology into our bodies through nanobots and biochips and other things, which can be very good, will we lose the line between humanity and technology? Is that line even important anymore? I would say, for myself anyway, as a person of Christian faith, that yes, I think that line is important. Questions about ultra-pragmatism, which drives a lot of technology today and technological progress, in quotes, this idea that if a thing can be done, it should be done now. Which is not necessarily a healthy train of thought. I mean, I don't think Christians call a halt to progress, the ones I know anyway. They are inclined sometimes, though, to want to press pause and just say, let's think about this. I think that's a valid role for us to play. Questions about, won't talk too much about this one, weaponized robots. Today we have remote-controlled semi-autonomous robots. Cruise missiles can fly and change their trajectory according to local conditions, but they can't decide who they will target. The technology is under development now in the United States and other parts that will allow that to change, where we have fully autonomous weaponized robots that can make those decisions. And that raises, doesn't it, a minefield of ethical questions. Would this further distancing of ourselves from the battlefield mean that we value human life even less than we do now? Who would take responsibility for the actions of an errant robotic machine? Would unscrupulous politicians or generals seek to blame the machine? And most importantly, would killing people become even cheaper than it is now, and certainly cheaper than taking them before an international court of justice? Nigel's book talks about this one, so I don't need to do much, but as we anthropomorphize machines, giving them human features and the ability to emulate emotion, as we add to that haptic technologies that fool not just the sense of sight and sound, but fully haptic, that also fools the sense of taste and touch and smell, we make it possible for people to truly have erotic experiences, one through the digital and then later through automation, through machines. Fully sensory sexual relationships. The University of Wellington published not long ago a study in which 3 academics postulated that within 30 years of today, robot prostitutes will have taken over from the human variety. And they said this is a very good thing for 3 reasons. It ends human trafficking, sex trafficking. It cuts down on STDs among human beings, but it still allows parts of Asia to survive using sex tourism. Now, just the fact we have academics talking that way, at least for me, is a concern. And human-android marriage might seem like sci-fi to you, but Wi-Fi was sci-fi not that long ago. And if we have accepted that marriage is not necessarily between a male and a female and God together for life, then perhaps we open ourselves to the possibility that a human being might say, well, I have an erotic relationship with this anthropomorphized machine. I have a sexual relationship. We have an emotional relationship and connection. I want my relationship to be recognised as marriage with all the attendant benefits. Final point, trust. The ethical questions are important because they address the trust issue in society today. The Edelman Communications Group every year puts out a thing called its Trust Barometer, in which it tracks the relative levels of public trust in institutions like government, media, the energy sector, over 28 countries. It said at the end of its study this year that Trust in institutions in the UK is at a, quote, historic low, with only 15% of the people they surveyed saying the system is working. Not the system is working for me, the system is working, period. If you look at these two columns, in one you have the responses of the informed public over a number of nations. 56% of the UK informed public, people who take an interest in the news and are actively engaged, as we are, I guess, here today, only 56% say in generally they trust public institutions. In the mass population beyond that, it's even less, it's just 37%. And that's something of a tragedy, really, because high trust equals capacity to act. If people are going to allow the church, for example, to have an influence in their future, they need to trust the church as an institution, as an idea. So the ethical questions are important. And I close with this. I believe the church has a role in this because I believe that influence is the church's mandate. It is not unusual for a church to want to have influence. It should not be. Christ said, did he not, in Matthew 5:14, that we're salt, light. City on a hill cannot be hidden, and it used to puzzle me for years and years. And by the way, I'm also an ordained minister, so I'm not a complete idiot in these areas, in case you're wondering. Matthew 5, I used to wonder what, I was writing a book called The Church of 2020, and I thought, what does he mean? Why did he choose the city on a hill? Was it just a throwaway comment? I don't believe Jesus did that. I believe he had purpose in everything he said. Why did he use the polis, the city on a hill? And I wouldn't make a doctrine out of this, but I do believe I can make a case for it from the Bible, that in part, Jesus intends his church across a city, in all its different forms and styles and emphases, to be in microcosm what the city could be if it lived under the kingdom values that he gave. That's a high and holy calling to which we are called. And I think we need to accept and teach our folks, I'm sure you do, that Psalm 24:1 is still true, that God is not just the God of religion and faith, he's the head of all things. He's the head of technology. It's just that most technologists don't recognize it yet. And Ephesians 1 said he's been given as head over all things to the church. So my job as a Christian, in part, is to express the headship of Christ. Not in a dominating, power-seeking way, but in a servanthood, influential way. To say, here's a model. Here he is. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Nola.